Have you ever sneezed so hard that it launched you right into the sky, straight through the stratosphere and into the outer reaches of the galaxy? Have you ever accidentally made a sentient snowman who self-multiplied himself into an entire army of deranged mutant killer monster snowgoons? Have you ever made a time machine out of a cardboard box, nearly got eaten by dinosaurs from the Cretaceous period, but got home just in time for lunch? Well, Calvin and Hobbes have. In the brief 10 years between 1985 and 1995, Bill Watterson chronicled the misadventures of a mischievous 6-year-old boy and his pet tiger that changed the way we look at comic strips forever. I grew up reading Calvin and Hobbes, not quite realizing how unique it really was. It differs significantly in both quality and tone from the usual comic strips of our time, such as Garfield, Dilbert, and even Peanuts. It got me wondering, how did just a little comic strip that only ran for 10 years come to have such a huge cultural impact? Today, we will be exploring how Bill Watterson reshaped the standard of the comic world through imagination, quality, and emotion. Calvin and Hobbes is about a 6-year-old boy named Calvin and a stuffed tiger named Hobbes, who is brought to life by Calvin's active imagination. But is Hobbes just imaginary? Well, to know this, we'll have to look at the very first comic strip. Calvin and Hobbes was first printed on November 18th, 1985. Calvin walks up to his father and announces that he's baited his tiger trap with a tuna fish sandwich. Calvin's father, only thinking he's playing a joke, says, "They like tuna fish, huh?" To which Calvin replies, "Tigers will do anything for a tuna fish sandwich." The last frame shows Hobbes munching a tuna fish sandwich and saying, "We're kind of stupid that way." From this point forward, Hobbes is shown as a real tiger around Calvin, but only a stuffed tiger around everyone else. This could lead readers to believe that Hobbes is just a product of Calvin's imagination. But the very first comic strip shows Hobbes as a real tiger even when Calvin isn't around. Not only this, but Calvin and Hobbes are constantly getting into fights. It's in times like these that it's hard to believe that Hobbes is just a stuffed animal. So what is Hobbes really? Well, believe it or not, Watterson never intended to give us the answer. As Watterson put it in an interview, quote, "I don't think of Hobbes as a stuffed doll that miraculously comes to life whenever Calvin's around. Neither do I think of Hobbes as a product of Calvin's imagination. Calvin sees Hobbes one way, but everyone else sees Hobbes another way. I show two versions of reality, and each makes complete sense to the participant who sees it." End quote. Through this mysterious nature of Hobbes, Watterson has a way of constantly holding our interest. But let's take a brief step back in time and look how Watterson came up with the very names Calvin and Hobbes. Young Bill Watterson was sitting in his college philosophy room, who was fascinated by the opposing views of John Calvin, the preeminent and influential French theologian, and Thomas Hobbes, the founder of modern political philosophy. And this fascination correlated directly into Calvin and Hobbes, as you see them constantly getting into differentiating fights and disagreements of morals. It's also important to note that Watterson is one of the only artists to explicitly say who he named his characters after. This should give us some insight as to what he wanted us to take away from his dialogues in Calvin and Hobbes. Now, Watterson had a commitment to quality that was unmatched by anyone else. Now, one of Watterson's greatest commitments to quality are in his licensing wars. Now, if you didn't know about Watterson's licensing wars, the Universal Syndicate, which published Calvin and Hobbes, wanted to merchandise Calvin and Hobbes as bumper stickers or stuffed animals. But Watterson constantly refused, as the Universal Syndicate had no right to force him. So, have you ever noticed that you never see a Hobbes plushie or a Calvin bobblehead? Well, that's because Watterson believed that it wasn't the medium, but the quality of perception and expression that determines the significance of the art. By showing Hobbes as a stuffed animal would only tell everyone just that Hobbes was a stuffed animal. It would ruin that dual perception of reality that Watterson had set up. As Watterson put it, quote, "The idea of a Hobbes doll is especially noxious, because the intrigue of Hobbes is that he may or may not be a real tiger. It makes no sense to allow somebody to make Hobbes into a stuffed doll for real and deprive the strip of an element of magic." End quote. Now, Watterson was also an extremely private man, which also helps explain why he didn't want his work to be licensed. Throughout the comic strip's 10-year run, Calvin and Hobbes won 7 awards, but not once did Watterson show up to receive them. Now, some of Watterson's commitment to quality weren't just in the direction he took Calvin and Hobbes. In fact, some of his greatest works are in his Sunday comics. The early look of the Sunday comics followed this format. These first two frames are what are known as the throwaway frames. Due to the differentiating sizes in newspapers, Watterson was forced to make the first two frames seemingly unrelated to the story of the Sunday comic, so that newspapers that were forced to cut out the first two frames would still get the rest of the story. However, this was extremely limiting on Watterson, and in 1992 he gave the Universal Syndicate an ultimatum, that he would either stop drawing Calvin and Hobbes or be given artistic freedom. So in that very same year, 1992, Watterson proposed to the syndicate a new format, if you can even call it a format, that gave Watterson the canvas he needed to quench his artistic thirst. This new format, unlike the old one, took up an entire half page of the newspaper, no matter what size the newspaper was. And Watterson could draw however many frames he wanted, whatever size he wanted, or sometimes no frames at all. This new format took up the last few years of the strip's run, and Watterson said that this was as close as he could get to his vision of what a comic strip should be. But Watterson wasn't just a cartoonist who drew comics. He was an artist, and he knew when to tone down his work. Through this portrait picture, Calvin and Hobbes are walking through a snowy meadow. But how do we know this? Well, Watterson simply drew nothing to show the snow, added footprints trailing behind to show how deep the snow was, and put a tree stump and tree in the background to give us a full feeling of depth and perception. Now, Watterson could have conveyed all of these things by overly detailing a landscape, but he didn't. Why? Because he wanted us to focus on what was true and beautiful in the piece. Clearly, Watterson saw potential in comic strip art that nobody else saw at the time. As Watterson put it in his 10th anniversary book, quote, "To attract and keep an audience, art must entertain. But the significance of any art lies in its abilities to express truths, to reveal and help us understand the world. Comic strips, in their own humble way, are capable of doing this," end quote. But to attract and keep Watterson's audience, he didn't just rely on slapstick humor like other artists. In fact, he often tapped into deep human emotions that no one else would dare touch. Through one comic strip storyline, Calvin stumbles upon a dying raccoon and immediately wants to save it. Throughout the story, the raccoon ends up dying, and we see the vulnerable side of the 6-year-old as he has to contemplate the subject of death. Through the last comic strip, Calvin and Hobbes are walking through a forest. Calvin saying, "Mom says death is as natural as birth, and it's all a part of the life cycle." She says we don't really understand it, but there are many things we don't understand. We just have to do the best we can with the knowledge we have. Don't you go anywhere. Don't worry. As you see, it's not meant to be funny. There's no unexpected punchline at the end. It just is, and it's beautifully bittersweet. After the strip ran in the newspapers, Watterson received a letter from a school teacher in Los Angeles who lived in one of the most dangerous and depressing parts of the city. She wrote, "Please keep drawing Calvin and Hobbes. I need to be reminded of the wonder of childhood. You are my daily mental health break." Now, I think we can learn a lot from Bill Watterson. He put his heart, soul, and mind into his work, and he made it big, but still managed to retain humility and dignity. I've asked a few webcomic writers how they got into drawing comics, and they all admitted that it was just a gimmick in high school, and that they didn't actually have any artistic skill. This is why you don't see as much depth in today's world of comics. But Watterson reshaped the standard of the comic world. Rather than merely making us smile and chuckle, Watterson made us think. His creativity and uniqueness is what made us fall in love with Calvin and Hobbes. And if we put our heart, soul, and minds into our work, we too can make it memorable. Just like how Watterson made us care so deeply about the life of a 6-year-old and a stuffed tiger named Hobbes. The last Calvin and Hobbes strip printed on December 31st, 1995, with a beautifully drawn Sunday comic that perfectly ended Watterson's 10-year piece of art. Now, Watterson toned down this piece and set it in a simple white backdrop, suggesting a world covered in snow. Hobbes says everything familiar has disappeared. The world looks brand new. A new year, a fresh clean start, says Calvin. It's like having a big white sheet of paper to draw on, says Hobbes. It's a day full of possibilities, agrees Calvin. It's a magical world, Hobbes, old buddy. Let's go exploring. Thank you.